The sun was beginning its slow descent in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the central public park. It was late afternoon, and the usual buzz of city life was momentarily replaced by the laughter of children and the friendly chatter of volunteers. Samuel Carter, a 55-year-old community organizer, had just spent a full day running one of the city's most cherished charity events, a monthly initiative to help the homeless and disadvantaged families. Tall and sturdy, Samuel carried himself with an air of kindness and resilience. His face, weathered from years of service, softened as he exchanged encouraging words with the volunteers who were busy packing up tables and loading supplies into vans. Despite the long hours, Samuel's energy remained boundless, his eyes twinkling with warmth as he handed out the final few bags of donated goods. He believed deeply in the power of community, and events like this were his way of giving back, of showing the city's most vulnerable that they were not forgotten. He moved from person to person, offering a handshake here, a hug there, his voice steady and reassuring. For Samuel, this wasn't just charity, it was a calling. In a quieter corner of the park, a group of children were chasing bubbles that floated lazily in the evening light, their high-pitched giggles filling the air. Mothers looked on with gentle smiles, while a few of the older kids helped pack up crates of food and clothing. Nearby, a line of grateful faces, men and women who had been living on the streets or struggling to make ends meet, stood patiently, waiting for Samuel's last words of encouragement. Just as Samuel handed a sandwich to an elderly homeless man, offering a reassuring pat on the shoulder, Officer Mark Johnson strode purposefully towards him. At 45 years old, Mark was an imposing figure, with a solid build that seemed to embody the authority of his position. His face was set in a hard frown, eyes narrowed under the brim of his police hat as he surveyed the crowd lingering in the park. He had been patrolling this area for years and knew the routines well, but today the sight of so many people still gathered, despite the park's official closing time, ignited a flicker of irritation. Samuel noticed the officer's approach but continued his conversation, his voice calm and collected as he listened to a young woman explain her situation and thank him for his help. He was used to dealing with skeptical onlookers, and the presence of a police officer at the end of a charity event wasn't uncommon. Samuel had always believed that if he showed kindness and maintained a calm demeanor, he could diffuse any tension. Mark stopped a few feet away, his boots scuffing on the gravel path as he squared his shoulders. "All right, folks, it's time to wrap it up," he announced, his voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the gentle hum of conversation. "The park closes in 5 minutes, and I need everyone to clear out." Samuel glanced at his watch and noted they still had a bit of time, but he could sense the urgency in the officer's tone. With a polite nod, he stepped forward to address Mark. "We're almost done here, officer," Samuel said, his tone friendly and open. "Just a few more minutes, and we'll be out of your way." Mark's eyes hardened, his patience already worn thin from a long shift, filled with minor infractions and petty disturbances. "I said the park is closing," he repeated, his voice louder now, commanding attention. "Everyone needs to leave. Now." Samuel felt the air tighten around them, the mood shifting as those nearby turned to watch the exchange. He could see the irritation in Mark's expression, but he kept his voice steady, determined not to escalate the situation. "I understand, officer," Samuel replied gently, "but we've had a great turnout today, and there are just a few more things to pack up. I promise we'll be done shortly." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. "That's not the point," he snapped, taking a step closer to Samuel. "You've overstayed your welcome, and you need to leave. I'm not asking again." The sudden harshness in Mark's voice made Samuel's brows knit together in concern. He knew they had a permit for the event, and he knew the crowd had been peaceful, cooperative, and grateful. There was no reason for the officer to be this agitated. Samuel opened his mouth to try and explain, but before he could get a word out, Mark's hand shot up in a sudden, angry gesture. "Enough!" Mark barked, his frustration boiling over. "I'm done talking!" And in one swift, unexpected move, he struck Samuel across the face with an open palm. The sound of the slap echoed across the clearing, cutting through the afternoon stillness. The impact sent Samuel stumbling backward, his hand instinctively rising to his stinging cheek as the sandwich he'd been holding fell to the ground. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers, and time seemed to stand still. Samuel's eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, the disbelief on his face mirrored the stunned expressions of the people around him. A woman nearby let out a cry of alarm, her phone already raised as she began recording. Others quickly followed suit, capturing the scene on their devices as a murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The mood shifted from surprise to outrage, and a group of teenagers who had been lounging by the fountain stood up, eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you see that?" one of them whispered to his friend, who nodded with an incredulous look. Mark, suddenly realizing the weight of what he had done, took a step back. His face flushed red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment flooding through him. For a moment he looked around, as if hoping someone might step in and validate his actions, but all he saw were faces of shock and condemnation. Samuel, steadying himself, looked up at Mark with a mixture of pain and disappointment. His cheek throbbed, but it was the officer's eyes, cold and unyielding, that struck him deeper. There was a moment of tense silence, a fragile pause where it seemed as if the entire park was holding its breath. Then Samuel, with all the dignity he could muster, straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the officer. "There was no need for that," he said, his voice firm but quiet, barely concealing the hurt. "We're only here to help." Mark's nostrils flared, and he opened his mouth to respond, but whatever he was about to say was drowned out by the sound of voices rising around them. A young mother, holding her toddler tightly, shouted at the officer, calling his behavior disgraceful. A group of students moved closer, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. One of them, a young man with a camera around his neck, called out, "What gives you the right?" More voices joined in, and soon the scene became chaotic. Mark, overwhelmed and feeling the situation slip out of his control, gestured sharply for everyone to back away. "I'm just doing my job," he shouted defensively, but the words fell flat amidst the crowd's growing unrest. Samuel, despite the pain in his cheek, raised his hands in a calming gesture, trying to regain control of the moment. "Everyone, please," he said, his voice rising above the noise. "Let's not make this worse." But the damage was already done. Phones were still recording, and the crowd, now emboldened by what they had witnessed, was not willing to back down. They began to move closer, their expressions a mix of defiance and anger. Mark's eyes darted around, panic seeping into his rigid stance. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain, as if the authority he had always relied on was no longer enough. Samuel took a deep breath and stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil around him. "Officer, we'll leave now," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor of pain. "There's no need for more trouble." Mark hesitated, the realization of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. With a stiff nod, he stepped back, allowing Samuel to turn and begin organizing the volunteers for a hasty departure. As they packed up quickly, the air buzzed with anger, disbelief, and a sense of injustice that would not easily be forgotten. Samuel's heart ached, not just from the slap, but from the knowledge that his peaceful charity event had ended in violence. He knew that what happened that day would have consequences that he couldn't yet foresee but would surely ripple far beyond the park. The tension in the park was palpable. The sunlight, now tinged with the golden hues of early evening, seemed to highlight the intensity of the unfolding scene. Several bystanders, their shock quickly turning to action, pulled out their phones and started recording, capturing every moment of the heated encounter between Samuel and Officer Mark Johnson. Some of the park-goers, who had initially come to relax or enjoy the late afternoon, were now frozen in place, caught between shock and anger as they witnessed a peaceful charity event unraveling into an ugly confrontation. Among the onlookers, a group of college students, who had been lounging on the grassy hill overlooking the scene, rose to their feet, their faces mirroring a mixture of disbelief and indignation. They had seen the entire incident, from the calm demeanor of Samuel to the unexpected aggression of Mark. One of them, a tall young man with a shock of curly hair, turned to his friends, his voice shaking with anger. "Did you just see that? He slapped that guy for no reason," he said, his eyes flashing with fury. Others in the group nodded, their phones already out, filming the scene and angrily narrating what they had just witnessed. "This is messed up," a young woman in the group said, her fingers moving rapidly across her phone's screen as she prepared to post the video online. People need to know what's happening. This kind of abuse of power is unacceptable. The mood in the park continued to darken, the once serene atmosphere now heavy with the weight of a brewing confrontation. A few yards away, a young mother pulled her child closer, whispering soothing words to calm the boy's frightened expression. Across the pathway, an elderly couple stood together, their faces reflecting a sad, familiar understanding of the injustice playing out before them. Meanwhile, not far from the park, Eva Carter was finishing up an intense meeting at her downtown office. The 32-year-old federal judge was known for her unwavering commitment to justice and her ability to remain calm under pressure. As she gathered her belongings to head home, her phone buzzed urgently in her purse. It was a volunteer from the charity event, the voice on the other end filled with anxiety. "Judge Carter, you need to get to the park. There's been an incident. Your father? He's okay, but something happened with a police officer." Eva's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as she listened to the frantic explanation. She knew her father well. His passion for helping others often led him to stand up for what he believed was right. But this sounded different. There was an urgency in the caller's voice that she couldn't ignore. "I'm on my way," Eva said firmly, grabbing her coat and keys before rushing out of the building. Her heels clicked sharply on the pavement as she made her way to her car, her thoughts swirling with concern and a growing sense of determination. When she arrived at the park, she was greeted by the sight of a tense crowd, their expressions a mix of anger and shock. Some were gathered in clusters, whispering urgently, while others had their phones held high, recording the aftermath of the confrontation. Eva's eyes immediately sought out her father, spotting him near a group of volunteers who were now trying to finish packing up as quickly as possible. Samuel's face was a mixture of calm and exhaustion, a red mark still visible on his cheek. His expression softened slightly when he saw his daughter approaching, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. He offered her a brief, reassuring nod, but Eva could feel the hurt radiating from him. Her father was a man of dignity and compassion. Seeing him struck in such a public and humiliating way ignited a quiet fury within her. Taking a deep breath, Eva straightened her shoulders and moved toward Officer Johnson, who was still standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression guarded and defensive. As she approached, the onlookers fell silent, sensing a new shift in the atmosphere. Eva's presence commanded attention. She was known for her poise and fairness, and even those who didn't recognize her could feel the weight of her authority. "Officer," Eva said calmly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "I'm Judge Eva Carter. I'd like to speak with you about what happened here." Mark's eyes flickered with recognition, and a flash of unease crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a look of defiance. "There's nothing to discuss, ma'am," he said stiffly, his voice cold and unyielding. "I was doing my duty, and these people were refusing to leave. I had every right to enforce the law." Eva's gaze didn't waver, her tone remaining steady and authoritative. "According to witnesses, in the videos I've already seen circulating online, it looks like you overstepped your authority. My father was conducting a peaceful charity event, and from what I understand, he posed no threat to you or anyone else here. Your reaction seems excessive." Mark's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, his hand instinctively tightening on the belt at his waist. "They were defying my orders," he insisted, his tone rising defensively. "The park was supposed to be closed, and I was doing my job. If they had followed my instructions, none of this would have happened." The crowd, sensing the confrontation escalating, moved closer, their eyes darting between Eva's calm demeanor and Mark's increasingly defensive stance. A few people muttered words of support for Samuel and Eva, their voices growing louder as they sensed a shift in power. Mark's authority, which had seemed so absolute just moments before, was now crumbling under the scrutiny of an audience unwilling to be silenced. "Officer Johnson," Eva said, her voice firmer now, "I'm not questioning your duty to enforce the rules, but your actions go beyond what's acceptable. Striking an unarmed man, especially during a peaceful event, is not how an officer is supposed to serve the community. My father has dedicated his life to this city, and your actions today have not only harmed him, but have violated the trust between law enforcement and the people you are meant to protect." Mark's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment it seemed as though he might back down. But then his pride took hold, and he straightened his shoulders, his face hardening once again. "I did what I had to do," he repeated stubbornly, refusing to acknowledge the growing anger of the crowd or the cold, steady gaze of the judge standing before him. Eva took a step closer, her tone dropping to a quieter, more dangerous level. "Officer, I understand the challenges of your job, but this isn't about authority, it's about justice. And right now, justice demands accountability." Mark's breath hitched slightly, his jaw clenching as he held her gaze. The weight of her words seemed to press down on him, forcing him to face the reality of his actions in a way he hadn't anticipated. For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a sign that perhaps behind the stubborn exterior, he knew he had gone too far. But before he could respond, the sound of a voice behind them interrupted the tense silence. "Hey, I've got it all on camera," shouted one of the college students who had been recording. He stepped forward, holding up his phone triumphantly. "I saw everything, and so did 100 other people. You can't just walk away from this." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, and Mark's face drained of color. He took a step back, suddenly feeling the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. His eyes darted around the gathering crowd, the phones, the expectant faces, and then back to Eva, who stood unwavering, her expression a mixture of calm determination and quiet fury. Realizing he was cornered, Mark's arrogance began to wane, replaced by a flicker of panic. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. "Look, I need to file a report," he stammered, the authority in his voice now tinged with uncertainty. "I'll handle this through the proper channels." Eva's expression softened slightly, but she didn't relent. "I suggest you do that, Officer Johnson. But know this, I will be following up personally. This is not going to be swept under the rug. The people here, my father and I, we deserve the truth, and the truth will come out." With those final words, Eva turned away, moving back to her father, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of pride and sadness. Samuel's eyes were tired, but there was a strength in his expression as he reached out to take his daughter's hand. "Thank you, Eva," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you here." Eva squeezed his hand gently, her own heart aching at the sight of the man who had always been her rock, now standing so vulnerable. "We'll get through this, Dad," she said firmly. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." As they walked away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the tension remained thick in the air. Eva knew that what had happened today was only the beginning of a much larger fight. A fight for justice, not just for her father, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of injustice and the abuse of power. And as she led Samuel out of the park, Mark stood alone, his authority diminished, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. His arrogance, once so absolute, was beginning to crumble, and a tiny seed of doubt had taken root, a seed that would soon grow into something far more profound. By the next morning, the video of Officer Mark Johnson slapping Samuel Carter was everywhere. It had been filmed by multiple witnesses, but the clip posted by Nathan Brown, a sharp-eyed independent journalist known for exposing local injustices, gained the most traction. The short, shaky video captured the sound of the slap, the shocked silence that followed, and the piercing look of pain and dignity on Samuel's face as he stood up, unbowed, before the furious officer. Nathan had been sitting at a nearby park bench, enjoying the late afternoon breeze and writing notes for an article when he saw the commotion unfold. His instincts kicked in the moment Mark's hand connected with Samuel's face. He had managed to catch everything, every angle of Mark's aggressive posture, every reaction from the bystanders, and the calm yet unyielding stance of Eva Carter as she confronted the officer. Within minutes of leaving the park, Nathan had edited and uploaded the video with a brief but pointed caption. "When those in power cross the line, this is what happens." The video spread like wildfire. By midnight, it had been shared thousands of times, accumulating a flood of comments, likes, and retweets. People from all over the city, and soon from all over the country, were weighing in, expressing their anger, their shock, and their support for Samuel. Within hours, the story had become a headline across local news outlets, and hashtags like #JusticeForSamuel and #HoldCopsAccountable trended nationwide. Eva, who had barely slept that night, sat in her apartment watching the video over and over, feeling a complex mix of pride and worry. She knew that this was far from over. While she was grateful for the outpouring of support, she understood that a social media firestorm would not be enough to ensure justice. The video had opened a floodgate, and it was now her job to navigate the torrent of emotions and demands for accountability that had followed. Meanwhile, Mark's world began to implode. As he watched the video from the privacy of his home, his stomach churned. He hadn't expected things to escalate the way they had. He had been a respected officer, known for his no-nonsense attitude and firm hand with rule breakers. Now that image was shattered, replaced by a 2-minute video that painted him as the face of police brutality. His phone buzzed with calls and texts, but he ignored them all. Mark's hands shook as he scrolled through the avalanche of comments. Most were filled with anger and disgust, condemning him as another bad cop who had let power go to his head. A few supportive comments, mostly from colleagues or friends, tried to justify his actions, but they were quickly drowned out by a wave of criticism. Mark closed the laptop, feeling the walls of his apartment close in on him. He knew that nothing would ever be the same. At the same time, Samuel's life was changing in ways he couldn't have imagined. His phone rang constantly. Calls from concerned friends, former colleagues, and strangers who had seen the video and wanted to express their solidarity. He had never sought out attention, and the sudden surge of support was both humbling and overwhelming. He spent hours replying to messages, accepting deliveries of flowers and thank you notes from people he'd never met. One message, however, stood out: an invitation to speak at a rally organized by several local social justice groups. They wanted him to share his story, to speak about his decades of work in the community and the injustices he had endured. At first, Samuel hesitated. He had never been the kind of man to stand in the spotlight. But when Eva called him and urged him to attend, explaining how powerful his voice could be in pushing for real change, he finally agreed. 3 days later, the first protest took place in the very same park where the incident had occurred. A sea of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Samuel, protect and serve, don't abuse, and no more silence." Among the crowd were familiar faces: college students who had witnessed the slap, families who had once received Samuel's aid, and even a few city officials. But the majority were strangers, driven by a shared sense of outrage at the injustice they had witnessed. The energy was electric, fueled by chants, passionate speeches, and a growing sense of unity. At the center of it all was Laura Mitchell, a charismatic and determined 28-year-old social activist with a reputation for leading powerful grassroots movements. She had watched the video, felt the sting of injustice, and knew she couldn't remain silent. Laura's voice rang out over the speakers, her words sharp and clear as she demanded accountability and transparency from the local police department. Her speeches were compelling, filled with personal stories of people in the community who had suffered similar injustices. Laura became the face of the movement, organizing regular protests, vigils, and community meetings. She coordinated with city officials, planned marches, and used her social media platform to amplify Samuel's story and the growing demands for change. Each demonstration drew more and more supporters until the park could no longer contain the crowds, spilling out into the surrounding streets and forcing traffic to a standstill. Inside the police department, the pressure was mounting. Officers who had once considered Mark a friend now avoided him in the hallways, whispering among themselves as they watched the situation unfold. The video had placed the entire department under scrutiny, and no one felt the pressure more acutely than Officer Jasmine Lopez. She had worked alongside Mark for years, trusted him, and often defended his actions when others questioned his judgment. Now she found herself torn between her loyalty to a colleague and her sense of justice. Jasmine couldn't forget the look on Samuel's face in the video, the pain and shock that lingered even after the slap had landed. Nor could she ignore the voice of Eva Carter, whose calm yet forceful words had echoed in her mind since the day of the incident. For Jasmine, the moral dilemma was like a weight pressing down on her chest. Every day she went to work, the unease grew stronger, and every night she returned home feeling more conflicted than the last. Her husband, Marcus, who worked as a public defender, had watched the video with her, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know what the right thing to do is, Jazz," he said one evening, his voice gentle but firm. "We talk about holding people accountable all the time. This shouldn't be any different just because you know him." "I know," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not that simple. There are people in the department who rely on him, who will defend him no matter what. If I speak out, I'm betraying them." Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "The only betrayal would be staying silent when you know the truth," he said. "Sometimes, doing the right thing is the hardest thing, but you're strong enough to handle it." Jasmine nodded, but she didn't feel strong. She felt trapped between the person she had always been, loyal, dedicated, and a team player, and the person she needed to become if she was going to face this new reality with integrity. The following week, as the protests grew in intensity and the media spotlight remained fixed on the city, Jasmine found herself standing outside the police station, staring at the imposing building with a sense of dread. She knew what she had to do. Gathering every ounce of courage, she walked inside, her steps steady but her heart racing. It was time to speak out. Meanwhile, Nathan Brown continued his work, feeding the media frenzy with a series of articles that exposed the long-standing issues of excessive force within the police department. He conducted interviews with witnesses, published reports, and pushed the narrative further, refusing to let the story fade from the public's consciousness. His phone never stopped ringing, calls from concerned citizens, officials trying to manage the damage, and social justice groups eager to leverage the moment for systemic change. The protests showed no signs of slowing down. By the end of the month, the pressure was impossible to ignore, forcing the mayor to make a public statement. In a hastily organized press conference, he acknowledged the gravity of the situation, expressing his support for a thorough investigation into Mark's actions and promising transparency. But the words rang hollow to those gathered in the streets who had seen too many promises come and go without real change. Laura, standing on the makeshift stage in the park, responded to the mayor's announcement with a fierce speech that rallied the crowd. "We've heard these promises before," she said, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "But promises aren't enough. We want action. We want accountability. And we won't stop until justice is served. For Samuel, for our community, and for everyone who has ever faced abuse of power." As the crowd roared in agreement, Samuel stood quietly at the edge of the platform, his face illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. He was not accustomed to being a symbol of resistance, but he felt the weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. He was grateful for the support, moved by the solidarity, and determined to see this fight through, no matter how long it took. And amidst the chaos and the calls for justice, Mark sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the screen of his laptop, watching the numbers climb, the shares, the comments, the mounting anger of a community that no longer saw him as a protector, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. For him, the fallout had only just begun. The courthouse steps were a frenzy of activity, swarming with reporters, community activists, and curious onlookers who had followed the story from its explosive beginning in the park to the crowded courtroom. Television cameras rolled, journalists shoved microphones toward any source they could find, and spectators held signs demanding justice. The buzzing energy of the city seemed to pulse around the courthouse, its stone facade standing tall and stoic amidst the chaos. Inside, the atmosphere was no less intense. The courtroom was packed to capacity, every seat filled with supporters, detractors, and members of the press eager to capture every moment of the legal battle that had become a national sensation. The judge's bench was flanked by solemn-faced guards, while the jury, carefully selected over days of contentious questioning, sat silently, their eyes darting between the prosecution and the defense. Samuel Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm yet determined. He was a man who had been thrust into the public eye in the most unexpected way, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had earned him the love and respect of his community. Beside him, Eva Carter exuded a poised intensity. Her eyes were steely, her expression focused, and she held her father's hand briefly before rising to deliver her opening statement. It was a moment she had prepared for her entire career, but never under circumstances like these. Mark Johnson sat at the defense table, his face a mask of stoic determination. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney with a reputation for getting results, sat beside him, flipping through a thick stack of papers. Mark's jaw was set, his shoulders tense. He had told himself over and over that he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply enforcing the law, maintaining order. But as he glanced around the courtroom and saw the sea of faces watching him, his confidence wavered. His career, his reputation, his very identity as an officer of the law were now on the line. Ava began her opening argument, her voice clear and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her eyes meeting each juror's gaze, "what happened on that day in the park was more than just an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a clear abuse of power, a violation of the trust between a community and the officers sworn to protect it." Her words hung in the air, charged with emotion, and the room went silent as she outlined the facts of the case, drawing from witness testimonies and the viral video that had ignited a firestorm. Mark's defense attorney was quick to respond, painting a very different picture. "My client," he began, "was simply doing his job, enforcing the rules in a park that was supposed to be closing, maintaining public safety. What you see in that video is a fraction of the story, taken out of context and sensationalized by a media desperate for controversy." He spoke with confidence, but his arguments seemed to falter against the overwhelming evidence that Ava and her team had compiled. The first days of the trial were intense, with witnesses called to the stand to recount what they had seen that afternoon in the park. There were the college students who had filmed the incident, their accounts unwavering as they described Mark's aggression and Samuel's calm attempts to defuse the situation. There were the parents who had been playing with their children nearby, recounting the shock they had felt at seeing an officer of the law resort to violence so quickly. Each testimony seemed to build on the last, painting a picture of a man whose temper had gotten the best of him. But the turning point came when Officer Jasmine Lopez was called to testify. Jasmine had agonized over her decision to take the stand. The weeks leading up to the trial had been a whirlwind of stress and sleepless nights as she grappled with the consequences of her choice. Her colleagues had grown distant, her superiors had subtly pressured her to remain silent, and even her friends had warned her against getting involved. But Jasmine knew that she couldn't stay quiet. Not after what she had seen, not after everything she had come to realize about Mark. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Jasmine approached the witness stand, her police uniform crisply pressed but her face showing the strain of the past weeks. She took a deep breath before beginning, her eyes steady as she looked directly at the jury. "On the day of the incident," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I was not on duty, but I was nearby. I saw Officer Johnson's interaction with Mr. Carter. What I witnessed was not an officer maintaining order. It was an officer allowing his frustration to dictate his actions. I watched him lose control, and I knew it was wrong." The defense attorney immediately went on the offensive, questioning her loyalty, her motives, and her interpretation of the events. "Officer Lopez," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "are you sure you're not here out of some personal vendetta? Isn't it true that you and Officer Johnson had disagreements in the past?" Jasmine's face remained calm, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about any personal disagreement," she replied firmly. "This is about the truth. And the truth is that Officer Johnson overstepped his bounds that day. I've worked with him for years, and I know he's capable of better. But what he did in that park was wrong, and I can't pretend otherwise." Her testimony was a bombshell. It was the first crack in the wall of defense that Mark and his lawyer had built, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. The murmurs grew louder, the tension thickened, and Ava felt a swell of vindication. Jasmine's courage had tipped the scales in their favor, solidifying the narrative that Mark's actions were not just a single mistake, but a symptom of a deeper problem. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued to grow. The demonstrations, led by Laura Mitchell, became a daily occurrence, drawing larger and larger crowds as more people from across the city came to stand in solidarity with Samuel. It was no longer just about one incident. It was about a community's demand for accountability, for justice, and for change in a system that had long been fraught with abuse of power. As the trial progressed, Ava's team dug deeper into Mark's record, uncovering incidents that painted a troubling pattern of behavior. There were complaints of excessive force, ignored and buried in departmental files, accounts of harassment, overlooked in favor of preserving the department's reputation. Each new piece of evidence made it harder for Mark to deny what had happened, his own past coming back to haunt him in ways he could no longer control. Meanwhile, the media's focus on the trial grew more intense. Every day, reporters lined the steps of the courthouse, ready to catch a glimpse of Eva and Samuel as they arrived, microphones poised for any comment. Nathan Brown, the journalist who had broken the story, continued to play a key role, publishing articles that dissected the legal arguments and highlighted the broader issues of systemic abuse within law enforcement. Mark, under the mounting pressure of the trial and the relentless public scrutiny, began to unravel. His temper flared in the courtroom on more than one occasion, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain his composure. Each time Eva calmly countered his defense, each time another witness contradicted his version of events, his sense of control slipped further away. In a desperate move, Mark's attorney tried to discredit Eva, questioning her objectivity and accusing her of exploiting the situation for personal gain. "You're a judge after all," he said, his voice rising. "Isn't it possible that you're using your influence to sway this trial in your favor, to make a name for yourself?" Eva met his gaze unflinchingly, her voice calm and measured. "This isn't about me," she said simply. "It's about justice. My father did not deserve to be treated the way he was, and neither does anyone else. This is about holding those in power accountable for their actions, no matter who they are." The jury listened intently, their expressions serious and thoughtful. They had seen the video, heard the testimonies, and witnessed the evidence. They were not swayed by the defense's attempts to muddy the waters. Jasmine's testimony in particular seemed to linger in their minds, the courage of a fellow officer willing to speak out against one of her own, carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the case became a defining moment for the city, a test of its values, its sense of justice, and its willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The courthouse steps became a symbol of resistance, a gathering place for those who had long felt powerless and were now finding their voices. It was no longer just about Samuel, it was about everyone who had ever faced the brunt of unchecked authority. And as the trial neared its conclusion, Eva felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She knew they had done everything they could, that they had laid out the truth in all its stark clarity. Now it was up to the jury to decide, to determine whether the system could be trusted to hold itself accountable, or if it would once again turn a blind eye to injustice. As the judge called for a recess before the closing arguments, Eva looked across the courtroom at her father, his calm and steady presence a source of strength. He gave her a small, encouraging nod, and she returned it, feeling a surge of determination. Whatever the outcome, she knew they had fought the good fight, that they had stood up when it mattered most, not just for themselves, but for a community that had waited too long for justice. And outside the courthouse, the chants of the protesters grew louder, their voices a steady, unbroken call for change that echoed through the city streets. The courtroom had been a battleground for weeks, with each passing day chipping away at Mark Johnson's carefully constructed defenses. The evidence, the testimonies, and the relentless scrutiny had taken their toll. When the judge handed down the ruling that Mark would be suspended from the force pending the outcome of his case and required to complete community service, it felt like a public shaming, a punishment for his arrogance and a chance for redemption, if he could find it within himself to change. The court-ordered community service was to be done under the guidance of Samuel Carter, the very man he had wronged. It was an arrangement that made Mark bristle with resentment. To be placed under the watchful eye of the man who had become a symbol of his disgrace was humiliating, and the idea of volunteering at charity events, something he had always dismissed as meaningless, seemed like a waste of his time. Yet there he was, standing awkwardly in the same park where it had all begun, surrounded by volunteers who knew him only as the man from the viral video. His police uniform had been replaced by simple work clothes, a fluorescent vest identifying him as a volunteer. The bright orange material felt like a beacon, drawing curious and judgmental eyes as he hesitated on the edge of the activity, unsure of where to begin. Samuel, noticing Mark's unease, approached with the same warm smile that had never wavered, not even after the incident. "We're glad to have you here, Mark," he said, his tone calm and genuine. "There's a lot of work to be done today, and every set of hands helps." Mark nodded stiffly, his pride still raw, and followed Samuel to a table covered in donations: clothes, canned food, blankets, and toiletries. His first task was to sort through the items, a job that seemed beneath him, but he set to it with the detached efficiency of a man completing a task solely because he had no other choice. As the days turned into weeks, Mark continued to show up for his mandated service, always keeping his distance from the other volunteers. He moved quietly and efficiently, performing his duties without engaging in the friendly banter that flowed around him. He felt like an outsider, and for a long time, he wanted it that way. Each interaction with Samuel was brief and impersonal, a constant reminder of the incident that had upended his life. However, as the weeks went by, the sting of his initial resentment began to dull, replaced by an unexpected curiosity. He watched as Samuel effortlessly navigated the chaotic world of community work, speaking with compassion and patience to those who came for help. The same man who had stood tall after being humiliated in the park was now leading charity drives, counseling struggling families, and offering comfort to people who had fallen through the cracks of society. Samuel's kindness, so steady and unwavering, seemed genuine, and that confused Mark. One chilly Saturday morning, the air crisp and cool, Mark found himself assigned to help set up tables for a food drive. As he worked, he overheard snippets of conversation, people sharing stories of hardship, of lost jobs, evictions, illnesses, and bad luck. They weren't the criminals or delinquents he had spent his career dealing with. They were people with faces, names, and histories, each struggling in their own way. It was a slow, uncomfortable realization that crept up on him, chipping away at the rigid view of the world he had held for so long. Later that day, as the crowd thinned and the volunteers began packing up, Samuel approached Mark. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, and for the first time, Mark saw not judgment, but an invitation to talk. They sat on a park bench, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to set. The city's hum seemed to fade as Samuel spoke. "Forgiveness," Samuel said, his voice gentle yet firm, "isn't something you give for someone else's sake. It's something you give for yourself. I'm not here to make you feel guilty, Mark. I'm here to help you see that people can change, that people can grow. But that growth has to come from within. I can't do it for you." Mark sat silently, staring down at his hands. His fingers were rough and calloused, a reminder of years of police work, of enforcing rules without question. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to remind Samuel that he had been doing his job, that he had been trying to maintain order. But deep down, he knew those were excuses. He had lost control that day in the park, and he had done it because he had seen Samuel not as a man, but as a problem to be dealt with swiftly and without regard for dignity or decency. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mark finally said, his voice hoarse and unsteady. "I don't even know if I deserve it." "It's not about what you deserve," Samuel replied quietly. "It's about what you do now, how you choose to move forward." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Samuel's words settling over them both. It was a conversation that marked the beginning of a shift, a small but significant turning point that would set Mark on a new path. Over the next few months, Mark's participation in the community events took on a different tone. He still arrived at the park early, still wore the same fluorescent vest, but he no longer moved through his tasks with the same detachment. He began to speak to the other volunteers, to listen to their stories and to share his own struggles. Tentatively at first, but with increasing openness. He learned about the challenges they faced, the systemic injustices that had shaped their lives, and the reasons why people like Samuel dedicated themselves to community work. The shift in Mark's attitude did not go unnoticed. Samuel observed the change with cautious optimism, encouraging Mark's progress without pushing him too hard. They continued to have conversations, sometimes long and deep, sometimes short and reflective. Mark began to ask questions, real, thoughtful questions, about the lives of those they were helping, about the structures that perpetuated inequality, about the difference between enforcing the law and serving justice. One cold winter afternoon, during a coat drive for families in need, a young boy approached Mark, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you the policeman from the video?" he asked, his voice innocent and without malice. The question stung, but Mark didn't flinch. He knelt down to the boy's level, meeting his gaze. "Yes," he said honestly, "I am." "Why did you hurt that man?" the boy pressed, and Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle in his chest. "Because I made a mistake," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "I did something wrong, and I'm here to make it right. I'm here to help, like your mom and dad do." The boy seemed to consider this, then nodded solemnly before running back to his parents. It was a small moment, a brief encounter, but for Mark it was profound. It was the first time he had admitted out loud that what he had done was wrong, not just to himself, but to someone else, and it felt like a release, a small step forward on a long road to redemption. As spring approached, the charity events grew larger and more frequent. Mark, now a familiar face among the volunteers, began to take on more responsibility, organizing food distributions, coordinating with local shelters, and even speaking at a few community meetings. He found a strange comfort in the work, an unexpected fulfillment that came not from wielding authority, but from serving others. The conversations between Mark and Samuel deepened, moving from forgiveness to broader issues, about systemic change, about what it meant to truly serve a community, about the flaws and strengths of the police force. Samuel spoke candidly about his own experiences with law enforcement, the times he had felt both protected and betrayed by those in power. And Mark, slowly but surely, began to understand that his own experiences, his own fears, and his own biases were not unique. They were part of a larger story, a story he had ignored for too long. The court case continued to progress, but now for Mark, it was no longer just about clearing his name or salvaging his reputation. It was about becoming the man he had once thought he was, a protector, a servant of the people, someone who did the right thing even when it was hard. It was about finding a way back to himself through the very community he had once looked down upon. By the time summer arrived, Mark had become an integral part of Samuel's volunteer team. He had built connections with people he never would have spoken to before, seen parts of the city he had never cared to visit, and learned more about the realities of life outside his comfortable bubble. It was a long, slow process of unlearning and rebuilding, but he was beginning to understand that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about earning it, day by day, action by action. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt hopeful. The courthouse was enveloped in a sense of anxious anticipation. The legal battle that had gripped the city was now entering its final and most dramatic phase, with both sides gearing up for what everyone knew would be a decisive showdown. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with journalists, activists, supporters, and skeptics. Even those who hadn't been following the case from the start now found themselves captivated by the trial's explosive developments. Outside, the scene was no less intense. Protesters continued to rally, their chants echoing down the city streets, while rows of police officers kept watch. The courthouse steps had become a gathering place for advocates of justice, with social media influencers, local politicians, and community leaders standing shoulder to shoulder, united in their calls for accountability. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge entered with a somber expression, and the jury settled into their seats, their faces a mix of fatigue and anticipation. Eva Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her demeanor composed but intense. This was the moment she had been building toward. Every piece of evidence, every witness testimony had led to this day. Her legal team buzzed around her, quietly finalizing documents and reviewing their strategy for the final act. Across the aisle, Mark sat rigid and pale, his defense attorney's whispers barely registering. The past months had worn him down. He was thinner, his eyes heavy with the weight of sleepless nights. His earlier confidence had eroded, replaced by a dawning awareness of the gravity of his actions. He knew the eyes of the world were on him, and the pressure was unbearable. Eva began the day's proceedings with her final round of witnesses, systematically laying out her case with the calm authority she was known for. She presented evidence from the incident in the park, playing the viral video once again to remind the jury of the moment that had started it all. It was the same footage that had circulated on every major news outlet, had been dissected on social media, and had sparked a citywide discussion about justice and accountability. The testimonies from bystanders were revisited, each witness painting a consistent picture of that fateful afternoon. Samuel himself took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted the incident, focusing not on his own pain, but on the importance of justice for the community. His words were calm, his demeanor dignified, and the impact on the jury was evident. Then Eva introduced new evidence that had been quietly gathered over the course of the trial. It was the result of her team's relentless investigation into Mark's professional history. She detailed incidents that had previously been overlooked or dismissed, cases where complaints had been filed against Mark for excessive force, but were swept under the rug by a system reluctant to discipline its own. Each incident was laid out methodically, showing a pattern that went far beyond a single moment in the park. Mark's defense attorney objected, arguing that these past incidents were irrelevant to the case at hand. But the judge allowed the evidence, noting its importance in establishing a pattern of behavior. Eva's presentation was unyielding, her logic clear and persuasive. As she spoke, Mark's composure visibly cracked, his eyes shifting nervously as his past actions were laid bare for all to see. Just when it seemed that the day could not get any more dramatic, Nathan Brown, the independent journalist who had first brought the story to light, requested to take the stand. His request was unexpected, and the defense team immediately objected, but the judge granted him the opportunity and were intrigued by his insistence that he had vital new information to present. Nathan approached the witness stand with a calm that contrasted sharply with the atmosphere in the room. He explained that, in the course of his investigation into Mark's background, he had stumbled upon something significant, an unreleased video, taken years before, which showed Mark in a similar confrontation, this time with a young man who had challenged his authority. The footage had been buried, hidden away by bureaucratic red tape, but Nathan had managed to obtain it through a confidential source. The courtroom went silent as the screen descended once more, and the grainy video began to play. It was not high quality, but the content was unmistakable. It showed a younger Mark, his demeanor tense and aggressive, forcibly pushing a man against a wall during what appeared to be a routine stop. The man's face was a mask of fear, his hands raised in surrender, but Mark's expression was one of unrestrained fury. The echoes of the past reverberated powerfully against the events of the present, making it clear that this was not an isolated incident. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and the jury's expressions shifted from shock to dismay. The tension was palpable. Mark's attorney scrambled to contain the damage, but the video was damning. It revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that could not be ignored: anger, unchecked authority, and a disregard for the dignity of those he encountered. Eva seized the moment, her voice ringing with conviction as she addressed the court. "This is not about a single mistake," she said, her eyes locked on the jury. "This is about a pattern of abuse, a pattern that has been ignored for too long. We are here today because no one held Officer Johnson accountable when it mattered most. And today, we have the power to change that." The defense's case crumbled in the wake of the new evidence. Mark's lawyer made a final attempt to redirect the narrative, arguing that his client had acted under extreme pressure, that his actions were the result of a demanding job and the stress of maintaining order in a difficult city. He spoke of Mark's service, his years on the force, and the danger he had faced every day. But his words rang hollow against the undeniable weight of the evidence, the collective testimonies of those who had been wronged. When it was Mark's turn to take the stand, he did so with visible reluctance. His voice was strained, his answers halting as he tried to justify his actions. He spoke of his dedication to the force, of the difficult choices he had made in the heat of the moment, but it was clear that his words lacked the conviction they once had. The video had shattered his credibility, and he knew it. As he faced Eva's cross-examination, his defenses fell apart. She was calm, methodical, and relentless, dismantling his arguments piece by piece until he had no choice but to acknowledge his own failures. The final moments of the trial were intense. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Eva's steady and unflinching, focused on justice and the need for systemic change. Mark's attorney desperate and defensive, trying to salvage what remained of his client's reputation. The jury was left with a stark choice: to condone the abuse of power by excusing it as an error in judgment, or to hold an officer of the law accountable for his actions. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on them. The courtroom was hushed as they returned, their faces solemn. The judge called for order, and the foreperson rose to read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Mark Johnson, guilty." The words hung in the air, and the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of reactions, some cheering, others stunned into silence. Mark slumped in his chair, the reality of the verdict crashing over him like a wave. The judge's face was grave as he pronounced the sentence: more intensive community service, this time under stricter supervision, and mandatory educational courses on human rights, anger management, and cultural sensitivity. It was clear that this was not just a punishment, it was a chance for Mark to continue the journey he had only just begun. Ava and Samuel embraced, the weight of the long, painful struggle lifting as they realized that justice in some form had been served. The reporters outside the courthouse scrambled to report the verdict, and the news quickly spread. Social media exploded with reactions, the hashtags number Justice for Samuel and number Hold Power Accountable trending once again, but this time with a sense of triumph, of victory for those who had waited too long for justice. As Mark was escorted out of the courtroom, he glanced back at Samuel and Eva, his expression one of defeat but also, perhaps, of understanding. He had lost the trial, but in doing so, he had been forced to confront himself, his actions, and the consequences of his unchecked power. The court's decision would not be the end of his journey, but a pivotal turning point, a chance to decide who he would become when he was no longer wearing a badge. For Eva, the victory was bittersweet. She knew that the road ahead would be long, that the trial, while significant, was only one battle in a larger war for justice and reform. But she also knew that they had taken a crucial step, that they had made a difference, and that her father's dignity had been restored in the eyes of a community that had stood by them. The trial had changed everything. It had exposed the flaws in a system that had too often protected those in power, but it had also ignited a movement, one that demanded accountability, transparency, and real change. And as the courthouse emptied and the crowds dispersed, the city felt different, a little less cynical, a little more hopeful, and ready for whatever came next. After the trial, Mark Johnson's life was stripped bare. He no longer wore the badge that had once defined him. The authority that had cloaked him was gone. Now he was just another man, grappling with the consequences of his actions and the reality of the harm he had caused. The once proud officer, whose name had echoed in city precincts, found himself standing on the edge of a world he had never truly understood. One defined not by power, but by service, humility, and community. The first days of his renewed community service were rough. Mark's court-ordered tasks placed him back in the neighborhoods he had patrolled for years. But this time he was on the other side of the line. No longer the enforcer, but the helper. He worked alongside Samuel Carter, who had offered him a second chance, not out of pity, but because he genuinely believed in the power of transformation. Samuel, with his enduring patience and steady guidance, became both mentor and taskmaster, leading Mark into the very heart of the community he had once misunderstood. The days were long and exhausting. Mark was tasked with everything from distributing meals at shelters to organizing clothing drives and participating in neighborhood cleanups. Initially, he performed his duties with a quiet sense of obligation, driven by the need to fulfill the court's demands and perhaps salvage some remnants of his pride. But as he became immersed in the day-to-day realities of the people he now served, something began to shift inside him. It started subtly, moments where he caught himself enjoying the work, feeling the warmth of genuine gratitude from those he helped. He noticed the difference in the way people interacted with him when he approached them without the shield of authority. He saw the hopeful eyes of children receiving their first set of new clothes, the quiet relief of parents who had one less meal to worry about, the smiles exchanged among neighbors as they joined forces to clean up a neglected park. These small, meaningful exchanges began to fill the void that losing his career had left behind. Samuel noticed the changes too, though he did not comment on them outright. Instead, he watched as Mark's involvement deepened. Mark started showing up early to events, staying late to help clean, volunteering for the most grueling task without complaint. He began engaging with the people he met, not as a man seeking redemption, but as someone who had come to care for the well-being of his community. It was during these long hours that Samuel and Mark's conversations evolved. What had once been polite exchanges turned into deep, candid dialogues about life, justice, and the complexities of human nature. They discussed the flaws in the system, the failures they had both witnessed, and the weight of carrying regret. One particularly cold winter night, after a long day of serving meals at a shelter, Mark and Samuel sat on the steps outside, watching the last of the volunteers leave. The night was clear, the stars bright against the black sky, and for a moment, the world felt still. Samuel spoke first, his voice low and thoughtful. "You've changed, Mark," he said simply without judgment or praise. "But you know that change is just the beginning. It's not enough to say you're sorry. You have to live it every day." Mark looked down at his hands, calloused and red from hours of work. He had heard those words before, but they resonated differently now. He knew that he had to keep moving forward, not just for himself, but for the people he had wronged. Over the following months, Mark became a fixture in the community, his face no longer recognized as the man from the scandalous video, but as someone who showed up again and again, despite the whispers, the judgmental stares, and the occasional hostility. He led neighborhood cleanups, coordinated food distribution events, and even started organizing workshops on conflict resolution, using his own story as a lesson in humility and growth. One of the most meaningful projects Mark took on was helping to rehabilitate a rundown park that had become a symbol of neglect in the community. The park had once been a vibrant gathering place, but years of disrepair had turned it into a haven for crime. Samuel suggested that they restore it, turning it into a safe space for families once again. It was a daunting task, but Mark threw himself into it with relentless determination. He secured donations, rallied volunteers, and spent countless weekends clearing debris, repainting benches, and planting flowers. As the park transformed, so did Mark's relationship with the community. People began to greet him with cautious smiles instead of suspicion. Conversations that had once been strained became friendly, and those who had initially kept their distance started to ask him questions, to involve him in their discussions about local issues. Mark found himself laughing more, sharing meals with families he had never known, and feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. Then came the Spring Festival, a large-scale charity event that Samuel's organization hosted every year. It was the biggest event of the season, drawing hundreds of people from all over the city, and it marked a significant moment in Mark's journey. He had been put in charge of organizing the children's activities, a role that required him to manage volunteers, oversee logistics, and ensure that everything ran smoothly. It was a test of both his leadership and his commitment to the community. On the day of the festival, the park was alive with color and energy. Tents were set up, food stalls lined the pathways, and children's laughter filled the air. Mark moved through the crowd with a sense of purpose, coordinating volunteers, solving problems, and making sure that every child had a chance to play. He saw familiar faces, those he had helped over the past months, and they greeted him warmly, some even stopping to thank him for his work. It was in the midst of this celebration that he saw Eva Carter again. She had come with a small group from the legal community, her presence drawing attention not just because of her position, but because of who she was, a symbol of justice and resilience. As she made her way through the festival, she observed Mark from a distance, noting the way he interacted with the families and volunteers, the ease with which he managed the chaos. There was something different about him, something she hadn't seen in the courtroom or in the months that had followed, a sense of genuine dedication, of humility. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment the noise of the festival faded away. Eva approached him slowly, a cautious but curious expression on her face. Mark, unsure of how to react, gave a respectful nod and waited. When she reached him, there was a moment of silence, an unspoken acknowledgement of the history they shared. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Mark shrugged, a small, self-deprecating smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't expect to be here either," he admitted, "but I'm glad I am." Eva's eyes searched his, looking for something. Perhaps sincerity, perhaps regret. Whatever it was, she seemed to find it, because her expression softened, just slightly. "You've done good work," she said, her voice measured. "The community has noticed." Mark nodded, grateful but wary. "I'm just trying to make things right," he said, "one day at a time." She studied him for a moment longer, then extended her hand, a gesture of tentative respect and acknowledgement. Mark hesitated, then took her hand, shaking it firmly. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a bridge between who they had been and who they were now becoming. As the festival drew to a close and the sun set over the rejuvenated park, Mark stood beside Samuel, watching the families pack up and head home. There was a sense of fulfillment in the air, a quiet joy that came from seeing something broken made whole again. Samuel clapped Mark on the back, a proud smile on his face. "You've come a long way," Samuel said, his voice warm with approval. Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight were fading into the night. "I still have a long way to go," he replied, but there was no regret in his tone, only determination. The festival was a turning point, not just for Mark, but for the entire community. The once damaged park was now a vibrant symbol of renewal, and Mark's involvement in its restoration had become a story of redemption that people talked about with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. It was proof that change was possible, that even the most unlikely people could find a way back to themselves. Eva left the festival that night with a sense of closure, knowing that Mark's journey was far from over, but feeling confident that he was on the right path. And for Mark, the festival was a reminder that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, one that required constant effort, humility, and the willingness to face the darkest parts of oneself. As summer approached, Mark continued to volunteer, now with a deeper understanding of what service truly meant. He no longer sought forgiveness, he sought to earn it. And with each day, each act of kindness, he felt a little more connected to the community he had once failed to serve. For the first time in a long time, Mark was hopeful, not just for himself, but for the world he was helping to build, one step at a time. The courtroom victory was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger. What had started as a single act of injustice in a park transformed into a catalyst for systemic change. The public pressure, bolstered by Samuel's steadfast dignity and Eva's fierce pursuit of justice, sparked a conversation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the trial. The local police department, faced with overwhelming scrutiny and demands for reform, began to implement changes that many thought were long overdue. New policies were rolled out with a sense of urgency. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and an independent oversight committee was established to investigate claims of misconduct. Training on de-escalation techniques, human rights, and community engagement became a cornerstone of the department's renewed focus, as leaders recognized the importance of rebuilding trust. They sought input from community leaders, including Samuel, who became a respected advisor on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Samuel's experience had turned him into a symbol of resilience, his quiet strength inspiring others who had been wronged to come forward with their own stories. He spoke at town hall meetings, often with Eva by his side, emphasizing the need for empathy, understanding, and accountability. His story, once a painful example of abuse, became a beacon of hope, proof that change was possible when a community stood together. Mark, meanwhile, had undergone a transformation that few would have believed possible just months before. He continued his work in the community, but now with a new purpose. He didn't just serve meals or clean up parks. He became an active participant in the conversations about reform. The police department, recognizing his unique position, invited him to speak at training seminars, sharing his story of failure and redemption with new recruits as a cautionary tale. It was not easy. There were still those who distrusted him, who doubted his motives. But Mark faced their skepticism head-on, using his own experiences as a way to educate others. One of the most significant changes came when a group of local educators approached Mark, asking him to speak at schools throughout the city. They wanted him to address students, to discuss the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability. At first, he hesitated, unsure if his words would be welcomed or effective, but Samuel encouraged him. "This is your chance to make a difference," Samuel said one evening over coffee. "Don't waste it." Taking Samuel's advice to heart, Mark began visiting high schools and community centers, standing in front of skeptical teenagers who saw him as the embodiment of a broken system. He spoke openly about his mistakes, about the arrogance and biases that had led him astray, and about the difficult path he had taken to make amends. Slowly, he noticed a shift, a softening in the students' eyes as they saw his sincerity, as they listened to him admit his wrongs without making excuses. They asked tough questions, and he answered them honestly, never shying away from the truth. Eva, watching from a distance, couldn't help but admire the effort Mark was making. She had once seen him as nothing more than a symbol of injustice, but now as she saw him face his own flaws and work tirelessly to improve, she found herself respecting his determination. Their interactions, still cautious, had become more frequent as they crossed paths at events and community meetings. They were not friends, not yet, but there was an understanding between them, a shared recognition of the impact one person's redemption could have on an entire community. Months passed, and the seeds of change began to bear fruit. Crime rates in the neighborhood dropped as trust between the police and residents improved. New programs were introduced that focused on community engagement rather than mere enforcement. Officers, including many who had once looked up to Mark, now took part in local outreach efforts, attending events and speaking openly with residents about their concerns. It was not a perfect system, but it was a start, one that felt more genuine and inclusive than it had before. The highlight of these changes came in the form of a grand community celebration, a symbolic reclaiming of the park where the incident had occurred. What had once been a scene of division and injustice was now the site of a festival that represented unity and progress. The park, meticulously restored through months of hard work, had become a vibrant space filled with flowers, freshly painted benches, and a playground for children. It was a testament to what could be accomplished when people put aside their differences and worked together for a common good. On the day of the event, a stage was set up at the center of the park, adorned with banners that read, "Together we rise, and change starts here." Food stalls lined the walkways, laughter filled the air, and the scent of barbecue drifted across the crowds. Local musicians played upbeat tunes, and children chased each other across the grass, their joyful squeals a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped the space. Samuel, as the event's host, stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. It was larger than he had expected. People from every part of the city had come, some to celebrate the changes, others out of curiosity, and still others to witness the fruits of the hard-fought struggle. Eva stood nearby, a picture of quiet pride, her eyes scanning the audience for familiar faces. As Samuel spoke, thanking everyone who had played a part in the movement, he invited Mark to join him on stage. The applause was hesitant at first, but it grew as Mark stepped up, his face a mixture of humility and gratitude. He spoke briefly, acknowledging the pain he had caused and expressing his commitment to the community's continued healing. He was not a hero, he said, but a man who had learned a valuable lesson the hard way. His speech was short, and when he finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause began again. This time stronger, more sincere. Eva was the final speaker, her words measured and impactful. She spoke about justice, about the importance of holding people accountable while also offering them the chance to change. She emphasized that the reforms taking place were just the beginning, that the work would not stop until true equality and fairness were achieved for all. Her speech was not one of closure, but of a new beginning, a call to action for everyone to keep pushing forward. The event continued into the evening, with dancing, games, and food. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the park, Mark, Samuel, and Eva stood together near the stage, watching the celebration unfold. They were joined by Laura Mitchell, the young social activist who had played a crucial role in mobilizing the community, and Jasmine Lopez, the officer who had risked her career to testify for justice. Together, they formed an unlikely group: a judge, a former officer, an activist, and a community leader, all united by a shared purpose. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a reminder that change was not only possible, but sustainable when it was built on a foundation of humility, transparency, and collaboration. Mark's transformation was no longer a matter of public speculation. It was visible in the smiles of the people who now approached him, not with hostility, but with the warmth of forgiveness. The journey was far from over, but the hardest part, the moment of reckoning, was behind them. As the night deepened, Mark looked around at the faces of those who had stood by him, who had challenged him, and who had made him better. He thought of the students he had spoken to, the families he had served, and the people he had once alienated, but who now saw him as one of their own. It was a feeling of belonging that he had never expected to experience again. Eva, watching him from the sidelines, knew that her own journey had been changed by the trial as well. She had set out to defend her father's honor, but she had also found a renewed sense of purpose in fighting for systemic reform. The trial had brought her closer to her father, strengthened her commitment to justice, and taught her the power of forgiveness. Not as an easy solution, but as a hard-earned victory. The celebratory event ended with a firework display, the sky lighting up in a dazzling array of colors that reflected off the faces of the gathered crowd. The final burst of light illuminated the park, casting long shadows and highlighting the laughter and joy that filled the night. It was a new beginning, not just for Mark or Samuel, but for an entire community that had learned to come together in the face of adversity. Mark, Samuel, and Eva stood side by side, their differences set aside, bound together by the story that had started with a single, terrible mistake. It had taken everything to get here: the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the resilience to keep moving forward, and the grace to forgive. But they had made it, and the city they loved was better for it. As the crowd dispersed and the night grew quieter, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and reminders of the past. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had found his place, not as a man who enforced the law, but as a man who sought to understand it, to live it, and to be guided by the principles of justice and compassion. The park, once a symbol of division, had become a place of unity. And for Mark, the journey was no longer about redemption. It was about making a difference, one small act at a time, for as long as it took. The end was not an end at all, but the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold in the lives of those who believed that change, however difficult, was always worth the struggle.